So once again, Jędrzej Buszta with Weird Space Junkies, Speculations on the Psychedelic, and the Zoom floor is yours, Jędrzej.
Thank you, Agnieszka. So I'd like to start by thanking you for the invitation to have this talk here. The last seminar in this semester of the Weird Fiction Research Group, which was an excellent semester. So I'm very happy to be concluding with a talk about a project that I'm currently pursuing. I'm still at the beginning stages of pursuing it. So what I will be talking about today is not in any way definitive and not a complete and organized entity, but still a collection of ideas, of approaches, of questions and ideas about how to examine, how to talk about the psychedelic and the speculative. Let me just share the presentation. So, all right. So what I'm going to be talking today is, as I said, is a kind of preliminary introductory talk about my ideas of how to examine the connections between the psychedelic experience, psychedelic substances, and speculative fiction, primarily science fiction and weird fiction. And my talk will be will consist of three parts. I'll start by talking about a bit about the theoretical framework for my investigations into the psychedelic. So to kind of build a theoretical context for how I locate my own research in the field of cultural studies that is interested in examining drug cultures. In the second part, I'll talk about the 1960s, about the new wave movement in science fiction and its embrace of the psychedelic, and I'll talk about three selected stories, three novels, which deal with the psychedelic in three different ways, and I'll end up with some kind of perhaps not concluding remarks, but some closing ideas about the dynamic between the textual and the visual in considering the psychedelic in speculative fiction. So that's the plan for today's talk. Yeah. So I want to begin with a short anecdote about a more current text than the ones that I'll be talking about in detail throughout the lecture. So Westworld, the HBO TV series, specifically about an episode that premiered last year in this third season, the episode 5, titled Genre. And in this episode, I won't be going into spoilers. So if you haven't seen it, I'm not going to be. I'm not going to be spoiling anything, but what's interesting in this episode is that it introduces this designer recreational drug, a psychedelic substance that Cal, the one of the protagonists seen here on the slide, digests, and throughout the episode is affected by this substance, by the substance called genre. And this is essentially a drug that warps reality so that it plunges him, the character, into a psychedelic trance, which switches genres every once in a while. So at first, Cole finds himself in a noir film. Then he moves into a car. When moving into a car chase, the genre switches again into a war film with Apocalypse Now, Raid of the Valkyries becoming the soundtrack that signals this change. And throughout this episode, the genre switches several times, also including romantic film, a crime film, a shining light horror, and finally, for me, at least importantly, a twisted out of this world experience of a hallucinogenic science fiction, which is signaled by the intrusion of David Bowie's Space Oddity into the soundtrack of of this trippy journey. And I find it quite significant that a contemporary, popular and highly acclaimed science fiction narrative such as Westworld enters the territory of psychedelic speculation by introducing simultaneously a designer drug that twists and manifests weird states of being, as well as a cinematic device that aligns the psychedelic aesthetic with direct ties to popular genres such as film noir, horror, and science fiction. And naming this fictitious substance as a literal genre, the creators of Westworld connect the psychedelic with the fantastic, as the mind-altering and consciousness-twisting experience of Cal becomes translated into the language of genre film, right? Genre television. In itself, an interesting case in the recent mainstreaming, so to say, of psychedelic and hallucinogenic distortions of perception and reality, whose cultural history will be the subject of my talk today. So the first kind of major problem encountered when pursuing a project such as the project that I'm pursuing, so a project that wishes to explore the interconnections between psychedelic modalities, ontologies, and aesthetics, and speculative fiction, is the problem of properly navigating through the seemingly limitless material. At first, the task seems to encompass the search for drug references in popular literature. So looking for and cataloging different examples of drug themes appearing in speculative narratives, while acknowledging at the beginning, that such a task is exhaustive and virtually impossible to accomplish in its entirety. As focusing both on the interaction between real and fictitious substances and speculative fiction, even when limited to one genre, like science fiction or weird fiction, ultimately coincides with the entire history of literature. Similarly, it is important to differentiate between analyzing writers on drugs and writers writing on or writing about drugs. Or in other words, to stress the difference between examining personal drug use and representations of drugs and different effects they produce in the fictions that these authors produce. So here I want to emphasize that at this point I'm not really interested in looking at the biographical stories of drug use of certain authors. So I'm not interested in tracing whether certain authors had any real experience, whatever real experience means, of course, with any psychedelic substance or any hallucinogenic substance, or not, right? This is, I'll kind of come back to that a bit later, but this idea of course, on the one hand, distancing from the personal history of drug use is, I think, quite important when trying to analyze the psychedelic theme in science fiction or in speculative fiction, because it kind of aligns with very different roles that these drugs will play, or that these experiences will play in the narratives. So kind of starting with the theoretical framework, the relation between literary production and use of different drugs has been explored by such scholars as Sadie Plant, Marcus Boone, Avital Ronell, and David Boothroyd. And these studies represent a wide range of what can be called pharmacographies, a collective name for a rich spectrum of genres and styles of writing about drugs. So today I want to mention just a few of these theoretical inspirations for my own consideration of how to navigate the terrain of psychedelic speculations. So Avital and Crack Wars, Literature, Addiction, Mania, Avital Ronell introduced the idea of pursuing a narcoanalysis of literature, proposing to perceive the act of writing on and about drugs as revelatory, both politically and philosophically, noting emphatically that, quote, drugs make us ask what it means to consume anything at all. Ronell coined the term narcoanalysis to characterize her proposal of a philosophical examination of addiction and literature, and her use of critical theory to unearth the persuasive technologies of intoxication, as she calls it, whose influence permeates the entirety of what she calls our narcotic modernity. Ronald specifically mentioned science fiction, or what she broadly characterizes as electronic culture, as the natural counterpart for what she views as drug culture. And there is this notion that this particular strand of literature is always on drugs and about drugs. So here, the quote on the slide, Ronald writes, if the literature of electronic culture can be located in the works of Philip K. Dick or William Gibson, in the imaginings of cyberbug projection or a reverse of virtual reality, then it is probable that electronic culture shares a crucial project with drug culture. In my still experimental and preliminary dealings with the psychedelic and speculative fiction, I'm also influenced by the writings of Sadie Plant, a British cultural theorist, cyberfeminist, and media academic, who has sadly largely disappeared from view both as a academic and public intellectual, despite being quite prominent in the 1990s and early 2000s. Plant's early theoretical work entitled 0+1s, Digital Women and the New Technoculture was influential in laying the groundwork for understanding cyberculture from a feminist perspective. Her later 1999 study, Writing on Drugs, moved away from reinforcing a spiritual reading of psychedelic experiences, as well as other modalities established by use of different illegal and addictive substances. So she moved away from this idea that the psychedelic or the drug experience is really a quest for reaching higher states of consciousness, invested in ideas of visionary and revolutionary distortions of the taken for granted social and political reality. So a tradition of looking at, of perceiving and thinking about psychedelic substances that stems from the original psychedelic movement of the 1960s, the countercultural movement in the United States, connected to such psychonaut media stars as Timothy Leary. Instead, in her study, Plant offered a materialist perspective of a, quote, almost incongruously grounded woman in the boys' club of crackpot speculation and wide-eyed messiah complex, end quote. In Writing on Drugs, Plant approached drugs as an interior technology, a reverse and supplement to the technologies of virtual reality and computing, and a way of further cyborgizing the postmodern body and mind through the process of inserting diverse molecular compounds into the body to enable sensations and perceptions otherwise inaccessible, a kind of organic attachment enhancing our experience of reality. Plant's highly original experimental writing, situated between comparative literature on the one hand and critical theory and cultural history on the other, offers a productive and alluring theoretical framework for my project. As it moves from examining, listing, and categorizing different emanations and articulations of the drug theme in literature, and instead asks to interrogate the myriad ways in which these addictive substances, and not only addictive, also psychedelics, right, which are not generally considered addictive. So substances both licit and illicit, how they have throughout the centuries shaped our culture, economics, politics, regimes of biopower, while simultaneously have been encoded in cultural texts. So this kind of dual perspective is something that I find especially influential in approaching such a project and such an analysis from a cultural studies perspective. So following Plant's direction, British cultural scholar Dave Boothroyd, in his 2006 study, Culture on Drugs, proposes to fuse critical theory with writing on drugs and adopts Avital Ronald's concept of narcoanalysis, defining it rather broadly as the critical approach to culture from the perspective of its articulation with and by drugs. His argument for the need to rethink the status of drugs in relation to cultural studies is, I believe, an important theoretical move, as it postulates a transfer of the drug-culture relationship from the margins or fringes of cultural theory and places it in the center of critical cultural studies. Here, the quote also presented on the slide, I think, encapsulates Boothroyd is arguing for, right? This idea that cultural studies, the kind of different levels of defining culture and cultural studies. So defining culture as a way of life, as a process that can be analyzed from a historical, political perspective, or as culture as creativity. So the kind of definition of culture mostly attached to artistic output, right, to acts of creativity. So that these three levels of assessing culture can also be taken up by drug-oriented cultural studies, and he lists these three distinct traditions in academic scholarship on drugs: the anthropological studies, sociological studies, and literary studies, right? And kind of showing how they all approach the subject of drugs from, of course, a different point, a different kind of starting point, but then can really shine light on each other in a way, looking at the totality of our culture and drugs, as the title of his volume quite skillfully, I think, encapsulates. And in the end, Boothroyd provocatively and I think quite persuasively argues that, quote, "There is not, never has been, nor could there be a drug-free culture, for culture is manifestly a form of being on drugs." So these are some of the theoretical inspirations from my own research, and it's important to note that there has been some scholarship on the relation between drugs and more specifically psychedelic drugs and science fiction, but this scholarship has been assigned either to writing on some selected authors, with Philip K. Dick being the prime example of the prime case in trying to analyze how science fiction is the literature on drugs and how a science fiction writer is a writer on drugs at the same time. And on the other hand, there's been several surveys of the drug theme in science fiction, but there still hasn't been I think a satisfactory kind of approach that would connect these many different threads and try to use these theories of drug culture, theories of the psychedelic, to properly examine science fiction or speculative fiction, weird fiction's entanglements with the psychedelic and the hallucinogenic. So what I'm pursuing this project is a way of trying to find these connections and perhaps fill this void in scholarship. So kind of moving on to the science fiction and the new wave movement and the cultural history of psychedelic science fiction, if there is, and if there is such a thing as psychedelic science fiction, and I would certainly argue that there is. I want to start by talking about a specific historical document from the 1970s, which sheds light on an early investment of both the state and science fiction authors into drugs and speculations on drugs. In 1974, the recently created government-funded National Institute on Drug Abuse commissioned a number of reports on the issues of drug use and abuse in the United States. Jointly titled as Research Issues Series Volumes 1 to 7, presented data from the last 15 years of research, mostly in the form of literature review, focused on the connections between drug use and employment, family and sex life, pregnancy, and what was generally viewed as the problem of addict lifestyles. The remaining 3 volumes, however, presented a different methodological approach, with the project officer at the National Institute of Drug Abuse acknowledging that their content is perhaps provocative, but certainly stimulating. Issue 9 of these 3 volumes was dedicated solely to the examination of drug themes in science fiction, while all other literary genres, or literature in general, were grouped together in the rather mundane-sounding category of fiction. So this report, published in November 1974, was written by, at the time, already acclaimed New Wave science fiction author Robert Silverberg. According to Silverberg, as a branch of fantasy, science fiction is ideally suited for the exploration of drug-related phenomena. In the report, he proposes an overview of drug themes in science fiction, offering a taxonomy of the different types of fictional substances, a taxonomy that is based primarily on their intended effects, but also their function in the science fiction narratives that he discusses. Silverberg's classification consists of the following types of science fictional drugs, and then I think that in most cases the category are quite self-explanatory. So these categories are the following: euphorics, mind expanders, panaceas, so kind of drugs that calm the mind, mind controllers, intelligence enhancers, sensation enhancers, reality testers, mind injurers, and drugs as means of communication. So the last category refers to ideas of drugs used to mostly to induce a state of telepathy and a telepathic connection between humans and aliens, I think, in most cases. So although this proposed taxonomy of substances naturally extends beyond the scope of real-life drugs, Silverberg notes two analogies. He sees the mind expanders as identical in their effects to the effects of LSD, and the sensation enhancers as working similar to cannabis. This classification can be divided into two categories, generally: substances that affect the body and those that affect the mind, with the latter remaining his main object of interest throughout the entire report. So although he offers a classification that wants to encompass the entirety of drug themes, and he proposes these different categories to try to organize the appearances of drugs, and it's characterized as visionary and utopian, that through the employment of drugs, mankind can attain spiritual or psychological powers not ordinarily available, and by doing so can enter into a new and higher existence. The move to what Silverberg considers visionary and utopian approaches to psychedelic aligns with the emergence of the New Wave movement of the 1960s, an avant-garde informal literary movement aiming to break down the barriers between genre science fiction and mainstream fiction, which was characterized by a turn away from hard sciences and an embrace of experimental styles of writing, what was now labeled speculative fiction. So speculative fiction, the label speculative fiction was also intended to replace the label of science fiction, which was then seen as not only worn out, but mostly connected to the more classic pulp literature that was seen as immature, juvenile, and not fully embracing the artistic and ideological kind of possibilities that were opened up by the New Wave movement. So the New Wave writers were also in many cases closely aligned or were part of the counterculture of the 1960s. The counterculture among which the use of drugs such as cannabis, LSD, peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, and other psychedelics blossomed, as did science fiction. So indeed, if we look at the speculative fiction written in the 1960s and 1970s, as at times openly manifesting a new sensitivity to the ontologically weird explorations of mind-bending and mind-altering substances, as exemplified here by a collection of drug-themed anthologies of science fiction, edited by Michael Parry and published in the late 1970s. Right, these are three anthologies: Strange Ecstasies from 1973, Dream Trips from 74, and Spaced Out. This one will really blow your mind, from 77. So I put these anthologies here as an example not only of a conscious decision on part of the editors to try to organize or anthologize this new strand of speculative fiction that is really invested in using in pursuing these weird drug tales, right? Unearthly drug stories as the subtitles of these anthologies allude to, but also to show that what was happening alongside this new interest in exploring drugs as a theme was also the new aesthetic of science fiction, also represented by the covers of these anthologies. And these of course are very kind of obscure texts, obscure anthologies that have been out of print, of course, for I think since the 1970s. So this is a kind of ephemeral type of speculative fiction, but nonetheless, I think quite interesting in that it tries to organize this, organize or try to even create a new psychedelic subgenre of science fiction, while at the same time representing this new aesthetic. And this is something that I want to just mention briefly, but this is an important aspect, at least something that has been also important for my own thinking about psychedelic science fictions, is this dynamic between psychedelic kind of textual employments of the psychedelic and aesthetical visual employments of the psychedelic and speculative fiction, and how they sometimes kind of work alongside, but sometimes or oftentimes may seem a bit confusing when works that are presented with these elaborate, fantastical, phantasmagorical, and definitely psychedelic covers are not necessarily works that explore these themes or these ontologies or these modalities of looking at a kind of distorted reality. And it's interesting that at the same time as the psychedelic became a theme in science fiction, there was a change in cover illustrations when compared to the earlier periods of pulp production of the classic golden age of science fiction. At that time, cover illustrations were more literal in their depiction of the story's content, right? These would be cover illustrations, sorry, that would present kind of literally what happened in the stories. That they would present, I don't know, different aliens, damsel in distress that need to be saved from the alien invaders, starships, alien planets, kind of big ray guns, and so on, right? Kind of quite literal and not artistically very developed depictions of the story's content. And since the 1960s, there was a change in the publishing strategy of many publishers, especially those who published in the United States and the United Kingdom. And this marked a move to a more mature era for science fiction novel art. So instead of literally conveying the themes or the subject of the story, these new covers these modern artists would rather convey a mood or tone, right, rather than literally rendering the plot. And in doing so, they help to I think to legitimize the genre in a different way, right? By allowing further experimentations in the visual, and by using images sometimes created by such established modern artists as Paul Klee, Max Ernst, or Vasily Kandinsky. They tied these pulp, it would seem, productions to the traditions of Western avant-garde and high culture. And the late 60s and early 70s novels, the covers are psychedelic in their expression, and they incorporate these countercultural elements in a way that would be unthinkable 10 years later. And they also demonstrate the inherent dynamic. This is something that especially interests me, right? This inherent dynamic in the psychedelic intervention into speculative fiction in the 60s, the dynamic between the textual and the visual modalities of the psychedelic and the hallucinatory. But kind of now to move away from aesthetics and come back to literature and come back to cultural text, I want to talk about 3 examples of novels that pursue the psychedelic theme and expand on it in different ways, while also continuing the trend of having a psychedelic cover, so kind of combining the psychedelic visuals with content. So I want to focus on 3 stories written by 3 writers: Robert Shrivelberg, already mentioned, the author of that report, Ursula Le Guin, and then Philip K. Dick. And I think that each case that I want to talk about represents a different approach to how the psychedelic drugs and experiences, what role they play in the narrative. And I think what is important, these 3 authors extrapolate their imaginative biochemical alterations for different ideological purposes, all in all encapsulating the contested meanings and the attitudes to the weird states of the body and the mind. Now, the first example is Downwards to the Earth, a novel from 1970, one of Robert Silverberg's most acclaimed novel from that period, a period that is sometimes referred to as a psychedelic period. And here on the slide, you have both the cover of the one of the first prints of the novel, but also the cover of a recent graphic novel adaptation of this novel, written by Philip Thoreau and illustrated by Laura Zuccari. And a very good, I think, retelling of Silverberg's original narration. So this is definitely one of the more thoughtful and elaborate entries in Silverberg's bibliography, both subtle in its symbolism and quite honest in its politics, while still betraying its ideological depth to the left-leaning but undoubtedly liberal speculative fiction written in the 60s and 70s, for better or worse, as it often is. It is a partial homage to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The protagonist is Edmund Gunderson, a former administrator of the colony world of Belzagor, who returns to the planet after it has gained independence. Downwards to the Earth is a narrative that addresses colonialism from the perspective of the white colonizer's blame and sense of guilt for his role in the subjugation of the indigenous population of the planet of Balzagor, a planet that is inhabited by the sentient species called Nildoror, biologically resembling Earth elephants, as you can see on the cover of the graphic novel adaptation. So this short novel is about Gunderson's quest to redeem his past crimes, in an attempt to understand the culture of the mysterious Nildoror, who he in the past dehumanized and forced to work for the colony, not treating them as sentient beings because of their animalistic appearance. The desired interspecies second contact is finally achieved in the last part of the novel, in which the colonizer is invited to participate in the Nildoror religious ceremony, a rite of rebirth, a ceremony mediated through the use of a local hallucinogenic substance. The psychedelic experience, an ecstatic communion with the highly spiritual indigenous inhabitants of the ex-colony, enables Gunderson to undergo a transcendent and literal rebirth into a new form, a hybrid alien-human entity. In Silverberg's story, the psychedelic experience is heavily imbued in religious undertones and is imagined as a gateway for achieving transcendence, up to the point of attaining an almost cosmic consciousness evoked by the use of local psychedelic drugs. As a result of this experience, the colonizer can literally share minds with the colonized, who turn out naturally to be much more spiritually developed than he presumed. Definitely much more spiritually developed than the Terrans who have colonized their planet. So here in this novel, the psychedelic component is brought into the plot in part to enable the redemption of the protagonist, allowing him not only to experience a state of altered consciousness, but also to gain knowledge from the experience of mind sharing, and not only to atone for his mistakes, but to emerge as a new entity, forever transformed by the experience and by the encounter with the local hallucinogenic drug, an alien technology for self-discovery and self-transformation. So this story represents a quite classic example of a trippy psychedelic speculative narrative, clearly influenced by the ideas and the and the meanings attached to the psychedelic in the 1960s movement, a countercultural psychedelic movement. Another interesting case is Ursula Le Guin's The Lathe of Heaven, a novel from 1971. A novel that is arguably a quite bizarre entry in her bibliography. Definitely, I think, a surprising novel for anyone familiar with her more renowned and critically acclaimed work in science fiction and fantasy. It is not one of her most popular works, written between two novels that are anonymously considered her masterpieces. So written between the publication of The Left Hand of Darkness on the one hand and the publication of The Dispossessed on the other. The Lathe of Heaven is less of a social critique as it is an extravagant literary journey into the territories of psychedelic weirdness. Taking place on Earth in the early 21st century in Portland, Oregon, it focuses on a non-heroic protagonist named George Orr. George is an otherwise unassuming man who possesses a strange and quite unimaginable ability. His dreams have the power to change reality. Whatever he dreams up becomes the reality shared by others, although it is only George who can remember the previous reality. So he is the only one that is hallucinating, and these hallucinations become not only alternative realities that he visits, but also the kind of reality shared with others that he meets along the trip, the psychedelic trip. Guided by his therapist, Orr uses his ability to conjure up alternative worlds that replace existing reality, each time basing the premise of this new world, supposed to be a better version of the world, on an utopian impulse to dream up a world freed of social problems experienced by society. So in one instance, Orr dreams up a world without racism, in which the skin of everyone on the planet becomes a uniform light gray color. In another case, in order to eliminate overpopulation, so overpopulation was and was definitely a grave concern in the 1970s, and something that was a theme explored by many science fiction writers. Definitely something much more which was considered a bigger problem that I think it is nowadays. So in order to eliminate the overpopulation, George summons up a reality in which a plague kills off most of Earth's population. And finally, to achieve his dream of bringing ultimate peace on Earth, George twists reality in such a way as to introduce an alien race of invaders. And this race of invaders pose a threat to humanity, and this threat seemingly unites humanity, therefore bringing peace. In many ways, The Lathe of Heaven seems like a novel born out of Le Guin's desire to test out Philip K. Dick-esque, trippy, hallucinogenic narrative in order to examine and creatively exhaust, perhaps, the idea of how mind-bending and reality-altering experiences could have political implications, even if temporary, illusory, and ultimately, as the story ironically demonstrates, unsuccessful in truly altering the social and political status quo. So the novel reads as both an imaginative rumination on the utopian impulse behind much of 1960s psychedelic movement, with its proclaimed countercultural message of self-discovery and its message of the transformative potential of psychedelic experiences mediated through such substances as acid, as LSD, as well as a subtle critique of the limited possibility of enacting real change through the subjective, highly individual and ultimately misguided, at least misguided in political terms, psychedelic experience, a psychedelic effect on reality. In the novel, the psychedelic is posited as not only mind manifesting, but also perspective mutating experience. However, it is an experience that is still not liberated from the social context. And so the dreams George can dream, dreams of liberal progress achieved through his own agency, are still not liberated from the limitations of his own wish fulfillment perspective. So the last novel that I want to talk about is Philip K. Dick's The Three Stigmata, novel from 1964, perhaps one of the most accomplished psychedelic narratives in his fiction. As I've already mentioned, Dick is the sole author who has received the most attention for his examination of the relationships between drugs and perceptions of reality. And as Chris Rudge writes in an essay dedicated to this novel, quote, Philip K. Dick's reputation as a drug-addled nut, an acid-crazed visionary, or the producer of a stimulant literature, promotes an image of Dick as a hyper-accelerated author of an ontologically weird and transcendental fiction, a fiendish hophead from whose hands spills forth a range of intraceable Gnostic images and narratives. End quote. So in the case of Dick, it is perhaps most difficult to separate the two approaches to examining science fiction on and about drugs. So that is to separate Dick's own personal use, personal experiences of drugs and the related mental states, episodes of psychosis and schizophrenia he experienced throughout his life, as he experimented with a variety of illicit and licit substances, including amphetamines, psychedelics, as well as antipsychotic drugs. So drugs both legally available at the time, as well as those that were not legally available. So it's perhaps most difficult to separate these experiences with the different roles that drugs play in his fiction, primarily the fiction that he wrote in the 60s in a period of real creative outpouring of I think, some of his most important novels. So here I want to highlight Dick's impressive sophistication and the complexity of his approach to psychedelic drugs, viewed as a technology and possible commodity, especially in the context of the 1960s pharmacological panic among the US public opinion. A public that surrounded primarily LSD and its uncritical embrace of some segments of the counterculture, a problem that was also raised by Silverberg in the mentioned report, and perhaps was one of the reasons why this report was even commissioned to be written. In Three Stigmata, Dick envisions a dark future in which the colonization of the solar system has led to the establishment of a drug-controlled society of the colony worlds, namely the colony on Mars, a still uninhabitable planet where colonists sent from Earth are sentenced to a dreary, nightmarish life in underground hovels. To mitigate their awful life conditions, a private and state duopoly introduces the miraculous drug candy, which, although illegal, is nonetheless sold to the colonists as a means for seemingly relieving those living in the off-world colonies of their harsh life conditions. Digesting the drug, which is derived from a psychedelic lichen fungus, results with a short hallucinatory trip in a consensus reality shared for a short period of time with other users of this drug. So a kind of hallucinatory trip to Earth, or at least to an idealized version of a middle-class suburbia somewhere on the outskirts of San Francisco. As Chris Rudge argues, quote, Stigmata, like many of Dick's novels, transcodes the violence of neoliberal or late capitalist economic constructions, such as the duopoly, and exhibits one of the ways in which biopower can be enforced through and by them, end quote. The psychedelic drug known as candy is distributed among the colonists thanks to a cooperation between the private company producing it, along with a set of perky pad layouts, which enable the process of translation from one state of consciousness to the other. So it's produced in cooperation with this private company that produces it and the state, represented by the United Nations Narcotic Bureau. So although illegal, the state-sanctioned production and commercialization of the hallucinogenic drug represents a nightmarish vision of the biopolitical regime, the pharmaceutical industry working alongside psychiatry and corporations producing these kind of consumer goods turned into means of controlling society, at least keeping it sedated. In this case, then, the psychedelic enters the science fictional as a way to allegorize and perpetuate the colonist subjugation to the drug's biopolitical and economic logic within a structurally entrenched and implicitly legitimized drug market, to quote from Chris Rudge's essay, One Final Time. So for Dick, the psychedelic drugs, regardless of their legal status, which changed throughout the years, LSD was available for some time in the 50s and 60s. It became an illegal drug after some time only. But despite the differences in the legal status of these substances, the psychedelic drugs for Dick operate on a completely different level than those which were present either in Silverberg's kind of spiritual consideration of hallucinogenic drugs as a way to enable communication, or in Le Guin's dialectic between the utopian and dystopian thought experiments that are perhaps made possible by this experience. As early as 1964, Dick was already aware of the inherent limitations to the idealistic visions of self-liberation made possible by the psychedelic experience. And he presented a very complex and highly critical assessment of the biopolitical, the economic, and the such sociocultural dimensions of drug culture. Drug cultures, or kind of coming back to Boothroyd's idea, or Boothroyd's assertion that culture is always on drugs, our narcotic modernity. So instead of conclusions, I want to end with just short remarks about a text that is perhaps less obscure than the ones that I've talked about, and a text that is perhaps more recognizable for participants of this semester of the Weird Group research group. So kind of turning away from the 1960s and 1970s, from science fiction, the new wave, and in a way circling back to the beginning, where I mentioned Westworld as this kind of contemporary narrative that uses the psychedelic, and turn attention to the weird fiction of Jeff Vandermeer. Both Annihilation and his more recent, I think, novels like Born of Dead Astronauts are, I think, also examples of how the psychedelic and the hallucinatory still permeates weird fiction and speculative fiction, but perhaps in a different way than it did in the 60s and 70s. And what interests me most here is not only how Vandermeer himself kind of uses the psychedelic while I think distancing from the cultural history of psychedelics through drugs, but also kind of this disconnecting the psychedelic from the material history or the materiality of these substances that create these effects. But what I'm even more interested in is what happens when his fiction is being translated into the screen, and when the textual psychedelics become a visual spectacle of psychedelic through the use of visual effects, as in Alex Garland's adaptation of Vandermeer's novel Annihilation, where the way that the visual effect, the team responsible for the visual effects, as well as the screenwriter and director Alex Garland, were able to turn the psychedelics into a visual spectacle, including here on the slide the image of the simmering. Sorry, so this kind of idea of a barrier between two realities, realities which no longer have a ontological certainty in terms of which one is the real reality and which one is an alternative reality. So I think that this shows also a move into a further move of a mainstreaming of psychedelic aesthetic and imagery, if not of psychedelic themes, as the way that it's presented in this adaptation. The transition from suburbia to psychedelic is a movement from the familiar to the bizarre for the viewer as well as the reader of the original novel. But here, kind of a final statement, I think what also is different here, and what perhaps shows that that there are as many connections as disconnections between the 1960s psychedelic science fiction and contemporary weird explorations of the psychedelic, is that here the psychedelic does not seem to be the experience of an individual, but it is more the effect of the world, or the effect that the world has on the individual. And in a way, Annihilation can be seen as a narrative that shows not only a psychedelic experience of someone who is kind of navigating through this strange reality, but it's more a story about ecology being in psychedelic decline. And perhaps here the psychedelic becomes more of an effect than an effect, and perhaps the only possible reaction to the devastating and estranging reality of our current situation, our current environmental situation. I think that's all that I want to say. I think I've also spoken for quite a long time, so thank you for.
Thank you so much. I love what you said at the very end, the kind of psychedelic as an affect rather than effect in the kind of recent and weird narrative. So that was really beautiful. Okay, so we still have a little bit of time. I don't know, like 15-20 minutes for comments and questions. If you would like to turn on your mic, please indicate that in the comment section, or you can just write your questions in the comment section as well. And since I already have my mic on, I think I would like to ask the first question. It's a little bit difficult for me to concentrate because I have a kind of busy family life happening in the background, but I'll try my best to be coherent. I was thinking about the Silverberg's novel and this idea of let's say drugs or kind of psychedelics taken from indigenous tribes or the colonized peoples. And of course, it's something that we see in the hippie culture and in the counterculture. Like, I mean, it was like very, very kind of visible in the aesthetics of the psychedelic at that time, right? That basically what we had was cultural appropriation of religious or spiritual rituals of the colonized, of the indigenous tribes. And then you see that in the 60s, early 70s, and then you see the kind of translation of some of these ideas into science fiction novels. And I was wondering if sorry, something happening in the background. I was kind of wondering if this was something kind of visible or recognizable to the sci-fi authors who wrote about that. I mean, did they tackle this issue of cultural appropriation? Were they aware of that? Because I understand that Silverberg, I haven't read this book, but I can guess that at least his book was some sort of attempt to talk about this, perhaps, right? At least show some sort of empathic approach to this issue. But what about others? I mean, were they aware of this movement, which is super problematic, this kind of colonization of indigenous people's traditions and practices?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I would say that no, they were not aware of the problematic assumptions coming kind of behind these appropriations, and definitely this is not something that is present I think in Silverberg's novel. I think he's still following the paradigm that you also mentioned, right? The way that the counterculture appropriates so many things from outside of Western culture and kind of took so much from Eastern religion, Eastern traditions, and kind of uncritically then kind of reclaimed it as this kind of new revolution that is happening here to the Western civilization. I think that many of the writers who followed those the kind of original psychedelic movement of the 60s and the ideals promoted then the idea, kind of advocated by Timothy Leary, that these psychedelic experiences are spiritual but also political. That if kind of to put it in simple words, if everyone has that kind of experience, then we will be able to change reality. We'll be able to finally get rid of all of these middle class restraints on culture and society. So I think that those authors who in the 60s wrote psychedelic science fiction in many ways followed those ideals and those approaches to it, and because of that, we're very uncritical of the movements of who is appropriating what here. I think, yeah, I remember also a short story by Silverberg, which is perhaps a move forward, because it's a story called Schwartz Across the Galaxy, where it also ends up with this kind of trippy ceremony between aliens and humans. But there, at least, there is a kind of exchange where the aliens bring their own hallucinogen and psychedelic substances, and the humans kind of trade off their own stashes of acid and magic mushrooms. So at least there is at least a transaction happening there. But no, I think that this is something that that is quite uncritical, and that's why I wanted to start with with talking about Silverberg's story, because in many ways it shows how this idea of the psychedelic experience as a spiritual transcendent experience that helps to in a way rid the colonizer of his guilt is a very kind of problematic way of mobilizing this experience and these substances and the kind of these politics, right?
Thank you. Thank you so much for such an exhaustive answer. While we wait maybe for some other comments, I just wanted maybe to follow up quickly on that. So do you see this at all in the kind of newer sci-fi that deals with hallucinogenic substances or psychedelic, that they kind of talk about the kind of ecological impact of, I don't know, taking substances from their, let's say, local habitats and what it does to local communities or indigenous tribes, even if we talk about colonies on different planets and different universes?
I'm not so certain. I can't think of at this point any narrative that would kind of address it openly. I think there is still a kind of alluring quality of this idea that there are these hidden knowledges about psychedelics and hallucinogens in this indigenous non-Western cultures, and that writers and creators are still quite attached to exploring that. Even when thinking about kind of not a science fiction example, but a horror example, and definitely a weird example. So Midsommar, the horror, let's say horror weird film, which also uses the hallucinogenic substances as something that is there to represent the strangeness, the bizarreness of this other society, this other community.
I think I might have an example. I just thought about this like a moment ago, and it's not sci-fi. Not really. It's more on the kind of gothic / horror side. It's called Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno, and it's a kind of story set in the 50s. It's beautiful. It's going to be adapted by, I think, HBO into a TV show. I'm really looking forward to it. But the interesting thing is, and I'm going to spoil it now. So, but the interesting thing is that there's this kind of hallucinogenic sentient fungi at the center of the novel, and it's not Mexican. It's not native, right, to Mexico. It's something that is brought over from England, as far as I remember. So this fungi is considered another form of the colonizer. So this whole narrative of white people coming to Mexico or to South South America or Latin America, and taking the mushrooms, the peyote, the I don't know, whatever substances they can gold, whatever, any substance they can get their hands on, is reversed, right? It's the fungi, the creepy, awful fungi coming from the outside with the kind of white people who are colonizing this land. And I found it very kind of powerful, and it's kind of rereading of this narrative. And I just remember that. So this is kind of my recommendation for you. It's a fantastic novel, and I'm not sure if it can be read in kind of in the through sci-fi, probably not, but maybe a little bit through fantasy. Okay, I think we have maybe one last. We can have like one last quick exchange, and then I think we'll call it a day. So, could you tell us a little bit more about the whole project? Because you mentioned that this is just a kind of part of it. So, what's the kind of main, let's say, main goal, the main thesis of the entire project that you're working on?
Yes, well, yeah, the entire project is more interdisciplinary in the sense that it combines an examination of the psychedelic discourse and cultural history of the United States with a more ethnographic exploration of contemporary psychedelic communities in Poland. So it's kind of double kind of field work, both in the United States and in Poland. And I'm going to be looking for kind of the connections between these different discourses, and both in kind of literature, but also in the practices, right? So kind of coming back to that idea of cultural studies, different kind of definitions of culture, and through that different definitions of how we can access the relation between drugs and culture. I want to look not only at how they are encoded in cultural texts, how they appear as themes, but also how they are socially practiced. And of course, I will be focusing on psychedelics, not on drugs as such. Although, as I kind of also tried to talk about in the beginning with this kind of theoretical framework, it's really difficult sometimes to distinguish between these different substances, and at the one point, on one hand, there is a need to look at this wholly, kind of a holistic perspective, to look at these different substances and not consider whether that kind of not considering the different effects and the different legal status that they may have. But on the other hand, I feel like the psychedelic substances and the psychedelic experiences and the entire aesthetic and history of the psychedelia is very different than other drug cultures, drug uses, and drug histories. So my project is about speculations, is about the psychedelic, but also about manifestations of social practices and social meanings that are connected to these practices, which I also I hope to study, although our current pandemic times really make that much more difficult in terms of doing field work among psychedelic communities.
Yeah. Yeah, I can only imagine. Are you going to look at the kind of visuals as well, like because you mentioned this kind of interest in the aesthetic practices connected with hallucinogenic or kind of psychedelic substances?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in the Polish context as well, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So I just wait a moment. Sorry, I have a another listener. Okay, so I think we'll call it a day.
Yeah, I think we exhausted everyone with my talk. It was long, but
very informative. Come on, I learned a ton. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of your project. Okay, so thank you again. Thanks everyone for participating. I know it's been a long day. Go home. I mean, you are home. Sorry, go and rest. Right? Rest your brains. Okay, and see you next semester. Bye bye.